If we're being honest, this is a roster that has some holes on it, but that could make the Jets a land of opportunity at positions like tight end, wide receiver, and the defensive line. That's if unheralded players are able to step up. We're talking Jets players who could surprise us in 2025 today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, May 8th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangandGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about positions of weakness for the New York Jets, at least positions we think are weaknesses right now, and why those perceived weaknesses could create opportunities for unexpected players to take bigger roles than we might otherwise think. And let's begin by talking about a position the Jets drafted early in 2025, and that's tight end. And I think we can begin the tight end discussion by guessing that Mason Taylor is going to be the top guy there. Jets drafted him in the second round. It was a room that, at least on paper, looked very weak. I think when you draft a guy early in round two at a position group that's extremely weak, you can typically presume the rookie is going to step into the starting lineup. We discussed this a bit yesterday. I think that expectations for Mason Taylor should probably be kept in check for year one. This is a player who's very much developing in a better situation. In fact, on most teams in the league, he would start out as the second tight end, maybe even the third tight end. And that would be good for him because, he could run limited routes. He could kind of, get his feet wet in the league without too much being asked of him. Unfortunately, for where the Jets are right now, they're going to need a little bit more out of him. So, this is a guy who still is kind of, I think, developing a route tree. He's still learning how to block. I think in the early part of the season, expectations should be very, very limited for Mason Taylor. And it's when you do that, if a player exceeds your expectations, it's a pleasant surprise. If he doesn't, then he's got a long way to go. His career, he's just getting started in what hopefully will be a long career. And as I mentioned yesterday, I do think that the early reps for Mason Taylor will probably benefit him in the long run because he's going to get an opportunity early in his career. And the Jets don't really have a lot of obvious players outside of Garrett Wilson and maybe Breece Hall who are going to demand a heavy target share in the passing game. So there can be plenty of opportunities for him as a rookie. And, this is the type of thing where you may not get much in year one, but he may benefit year two, year three, year four from all the opportunities he gets year one. It may be the type of thing that speeds up his development. But after Mason Taylor, it's a kind of an open competition for that second tight end spot. I presume Jeremy Rucker would have the inside track just because, he's been on the team before. But, I don't know. It is a new coaching staff. And I feel like a new coaching staff gives everybody a fresh start. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing for players like Rucker or really anybody else, because Rucker would have been the incumbent number two tight end on one hand. On the other hand, he really has not been very impressive to date. A guy who I can't really think of any aspect of Jeremy Rucker's game which has been even adequate so far in his career. And I would almost say if you've watched Jeremy Rucker's first 3 years in his career, he's in some ways kind of regressed from where he was at Ohio State. In Ohio State, he was kind of a reliable option in the passing game. He never really got the ball because Ohio State's receiver room was so loaded. But he was a decent secondary option in the passing game, and he was, at least a somewhat decent blocker. I think that he throws the occasional highlight reel block in the NFL, but really hasn't been consistent. But this is a new opportunity. You got a new coaching staff in here, working with new people. They don't have preconceived notions of you. Right now in the NFL, for a second tight end, you want somebody who's a functional pass catcher and someone who's a good blocker. And Rucker, if he has time to develop this offseason, if he takes to the new coaching, he's got the frame to be a good blocker. It's never been a question of whether Rucker had the potential to be a good blocker. It's just a question of, how good would he be? And he really hasn't developed consistency today. Again, sometimes you see the highlight reels with Rucker where he just annihilates somebody, but those don't happen all that frequently. And I think you'd be better off less highlight reels and just more consistent being an obstruction to the defender. But there are guys behind Rucker who have an opportunity. I mean, I think one of the kind of under the radar candidates is Stone Smart. And, normally a guy like Stone Smart, who's going to turn 27 in the start of the season and hasn't really done anything to date, normally that's a guy I just write off. Because by the time you're 27, if you haven't become a good player in the NFL, it's really difficult to see the path. So one of the things I try and assess when I determine how much potential a player has is there a possible story I can tell that would suggest that this guy still has a path to improve? And again, normally when you're at like 27, there's no path, because if you were good already, if you were going to be good, you probably would have gotten there by 27. But Stone Smart's kind of an outlier because he spent most of his college career as a quarterback, and then he moved to wide receiver, and then he went undrafted in 2022 and became a tight end. So most 27-year-olds, if you're a 27-year-old who's played tight end your whole career, odds are really against you, like, developing. But if you're a 27-year-old and you're new to the position, is there like a credible path you can claim that, maybe there's room to improve? Well, if you've only played the position for 3 years, maybe there's a path. And he's got a good athletic profile. The Chargers let him go, but I'm not convinced the Chargers let him go for a lack of ability. I think the Chargers let him go because he's kind of an undersized, athletic type of tight end. That's not the type of tight end Jim Harbaugh wants in his offense. If you follow the Jim Harbaugh offense through his career with the Chargers, with Michigan, with the 49ers, you go back to Stanford. Harbaugh likes physical guys. He likes to run the ball. He likes big formations where everybody can block. And that's not really what Stone Smart can do. Look, I think the odds are against Stone Smart. The odds are against any of the players we're going to discuss on today's episode. But there's nobody really obvious behind Mason Taylor right now for that second tight end job. And, maybe Stone Smart doesn't have the profile I mentioned of a blocker, but if you can add like quality receiving threat, you can probably carve out a role on an offense that doesn't have a ton of great targets. And then you also have, some other guys, Neil Johnson, a young guy out of Louisiana, and Zach Kuntz, who was a 7th round pick a couple of years ago. Kuntz entered the NFL with one of the most outstanding athletic profiles. I mean, he absolutely hit his athletic testing out of the park when he came out of Old Dominion. Actually, there was a little bit of overlap. Stone Smart and Zach Kuntz both played college ball at Old Dominion, and they actually were on the same team for a year. So odd that the Jets have like these two kind of project tight ends who were teammates in college. Kuntz hasn't really developed. One of the things in the late rounds is you'll bet on athletic profile and you'll hope that a guy can actually learn how to play a position. But of course, there's more to being on an NFL field than being a great athlete. You want great football players. There are lots of guys who are great athletes who happen to play football. And to this point in his career, Zach Kuntz has been one of those players. The question, again, new coaching staff, a fresh set of eyes, but also maybe a coaching staff that can get through to you in a way the previous coaching staff failed. Again, most of these players aren't going to make it, but there's an opportunity here for the second tight end job to be earned. Even after the Jets drafted Mason Taylor in the 2nd round, there's a chance, if one of these guys can develop at all and prove that they can handle the duties of a second tight end, they'll have an opportunity to carve out playing time this year and perhaps be part of the team in the longer run. During the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll keep talking about pass catchers. At the wide receiver position, the Jets have Garrett Wilson. They have a lot of unremarkable veterans. They have some young, really unproven guys who haven't done a whole lot. But those young, unproven guys, if they develop, who knows, maybe they can make an impact on the team. We'll talk about who they are and their path to success as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like the atmosphere of an NBA playoff game. Every bucket, every defensive stop, every moment feels huge. It's electric in the arena, and with Game Time, you can be part of it without the stress of last-minute ticket hunting. Game Time makes it fast and easy to get playoff tickets, even when demand is sky high. Prices on the app actually go down as a tip-off gets closer, and their last-minute deals can save you up to 60%. I've used Game Time myself. It's not just for the NBA playoffs. It's for any sport you want. Music, concert, theater, you name it. Game Time's got you covered. I've used Game Time again on many occasions in the past, And I've used it last minute. You can't believe the deals you get. You also get the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it's going to look like at your venue before you arrive. So no surprises, no unexpected obstructed views. And they have all in pricing, no hidden fees at checkout. You know what you're going to pay before you pay. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms of play. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're talking about positions where the Jets are pretty weak on paper, but there's a positive to that. It means that there are opportunities for players to carve out roles. Unheralded players, if they can take their game to the next level, may surprise us in this coming season. Now, if you look at the wide receiver position, Jets start off with a very good number one receiver in Garrett Wilson, a guy who's probably on the upper half of number one receivers across the NFL. And then things fall off quickly. And as much as things fall off, I think I would have to criticize the Jets for what they've done at the wide receiver position this offseason. From the standpoint, they've just brought in a lot of guys who have very, very limited upside. Tyler Johnson out of Minnesota, a guy who's bounced around the league, spent some time with the Bucs, spent some time with the Rams, 26 years old. I don't know that there's much left with Tyler Johnson as far as potential goes. Josh Reynolds, he hasn't really produced all that much. Even in his best days, he was maybe a number 3 receiver, brought in, I think, to help install the offense, but there's not a lot of upside there. I don't think we're going to get much production out of him. Jets keep Allen Lazard. Well, they cut his salary. I actually think he's fine at his current salary, but obviously not a very impressive guy. And sometimes like individual moves make sense. Sometimes you can like justify a series of individual moves, but altogether, like, they're not that great. And I feel like that's kind of the Jets offseason at the receiver position. Like, I can justify keeping Allen Lazard at the contract he got. I can justify Tyler Johnson to kind of help install the offense because he knows kind of the intricacies of Tanner Engstrand's system. I can justify Tyler Johnson as, a veteran depth guy. But I have a tough time justifying those being the moves the Jets made at wide receiver because there's really not a lot behind Garrett Wilson. So now you look to the younger guys. And, you wish that there were guys you felt better about with youth. But there are opportunities for some of these guys to surprise us. I think this is a Jets offense that is going to be very limited in what it can do threatening a defense vertically. And I have spoken a lot about Arian Smith, the 4th round pick out of Georgia, and how not thrilled I was that the Jets made that pick at that point in the draft. I felt that there were better options available. I felt that there were higher upside plays available than Arian Smith. But nobody can doubt his speed. And again, this is a Jets offense that could be starved to make big plays. Arian Smith, again, if you're looking for like a story that like maybe tells me a player's on an upward trajectory, it's a bit of a stretch, but he did have his breakout season his final year at Georgia. So maybe that's a sign of improvement. Nobody can doubt his speed. And as much as like the Jets offense is going to be threatened, is going to have issues threatening defenses vertically, that means that they're going to have to threaten defenses horizontally. That means, they're going to have to go east and west and find ways to make big plays, with the ball, stretching the field at the line of scrimmage. And maybe Arian Smith can be the guy who helps with that. I think at the very least, he'll probably see a fair share of snaps on gadget type plays, plays where he's lined up at a unique spot, plays where they throw him laterals, plays where they throw him screens, just try and get him ahead of steam. And that could be handoffs as well. He could be kind of like conceivably using his speed. The Jets could kind of use him as a Swiss Army knife type player and kind of manufacture production that way. A quality offensive coordinator can use speed and at least manufacture a handful of positive plays a game, just by design, just by getting a quality player, a quality speedster, and a ball in good situations. So, Arian Smith potentially could carve out a role. Another guy who I don't have a ton of hope for, but who knows, new coaching staff, maybe he learns a little bit. And it's the guy from the 3rd round last year, Malachi Corley, who the Jets traded up for. And this is an area where I might criticize the Jets, not the current regime, but the past regime, because it feels like Joe Douglas kind of got in his own way in this one. I think, sometimes Joe Douglas had a tendency to kind of super scout a pick I think trying, come up with the idea that like I could spot something in the player nobody else can. And I feel like that's kind of what he did with Malachi Corley, because he was trying to trade up. The reports go as far as the middle of the second round, and Corley lasted until the top of the third round when the Jets finally traded up for him, and he may have very well fallen to the Jets where they were originally picking in the third round had they not done anything. Corley did not have a good rookie season. In fact, the only play of note he had was a play on Halloween night against the Houston Texans where he got a handoff and essentially had a wide open path opened up to him by excellent blocking. And then he dropped the ball on the 1 yard line and didn't score. And the Jets turned the ball over because he dropped the ball celebrating a touchdown before he got into the end zone. And that was about the most notable play from Corley's rookie season. And look, I think when the Jets drafted him, there should have been an acknowledgement from the team that this was going to take some time, that Corley was going to be a project, because in college, he caught a bunch of screens. He was called the Yak King, yards after catch king. The reason it was the yards after catch king is that he caught everything at the line of scrimmage. And like pretty much all of his yardage came after the catch because he didn't really run routes. So it's tough to go from 0 to 60 when we're talking about like knowing how to run a route in the NFL. And Jet, for a team with Aaron Rodgers, a quarterback who wants his receivers to run very precise routes and read defenses effectively, that was not a match made in heaven. Now, year two, how much has Corley learned in year one, sitting on the bench, working on the practice field? He couldn't really get on the field, so he couldn't really get the game reps that might have helped him develop. So now you go to the next best thing, working on the practice field, and a new coaching staff coming in. I don't know how far Corley can really come as a route runner in one offseason, because he's really starting from scratch. But again, this Jets defense is going to be challenged to threaten teams deep, which means, you're going to have guys who take the ball at the line of scrimmage and make plays, east and west. Again, what I'm saying, threatening a defense horizontally means a guy has to catch the ball at the line of scrimmage and be able to do something with it and break off big plays. Corley kind of approached the receiver position like a running back. Now, I don't know how well that translates, especially coming from a small school. But again, another guy, if the Jets are looking to manufacture touches, if the Jets are just trying to manufacture some degree of offense, he could be a guy who sees screens this year. This Jets offense is going to have to be a little creative. They're not going to be able to produce as much from the conventional passing game as you'd like. So that means that the production has to come in other ways. And maybe Corley, with a little bit improved route running and an ability to make plays on screens, could carve out a role on this offense, because there really aren't many other places at the wide receiver position where the Jets are going to be able to squeeze production from. So it does open up a door for Corley to surprise us and maybe carve out, maybe get something, maybe produce some extent, at least grow from the player he was in year one. As you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a spot where the Jets are better off than tight end or wide receiver, and that's on the defensive line. Jets have some good players there. I wouldn't say it's a weakness, but after the top couple of guys, the obvious producers drop off, and there are going to be playing time opportunities for other guys to step up. We'll talk about what those opportunities are and who could step up as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Upwork. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. And with Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more. Experts ready to help you take your business to the next level. Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. If you need help with a marketing campaign, Upwork can connect you with a freelance expert who delivers incredible results. Posting a job is free and simple, and within a day, multiple qualified candidates you'll have to choose from. Instead of hiring full-time, Upwork helps find affordable, top-tier freelancers to scale your business effectively. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com, to connect with top talent and grow your business today. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about positions where the Jets are weak and kind of giving a positive spin on it, because if you're weak at a position, that means that there's an opportunity for somebody unheralded to step up. Now let's turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball. In the first two segments, we've talked about the offense, and we've talked about positions where the Jets don't really have a lot to work with. Tight end, where they just have a second-round pick who hasn't even played yet in Mason Taylor. Wide receiver, where they have a good player in Garrett Wilson to start off with, but very little behind him. Let's talk about the defensive line, because the defensive line is a spot where the Jets have some players to work with. You've got Will McDonald, who had a breakout season last year, double-digit sacks. Jermaine Johnson coming off an injury, but hopefully he bounces back. But a guy who's been a really good player when he's been on the field, pre-injury. And the defensive tackle, Quinnen Williams, maybe the best player on the team. But you don't have the depth that you had 2 years ago. The Jets used to be really deep up front on the defensive line. They're good now. Like, they have good players, but they don't have the level of depth that they did in the past. And this opens up an opportunity. And, there's really like one spot on the defensive line, or one defensive end role that Jets are lacking now. And they've lacked it since they traded John Franklin Myers to Denver. And that's kind of like a power end, a guy who can really hold the point of attack in the run game. I guess Jermaine Johnson can do it, but I think of Jermaine Johnson as more of like a two-way guy, a guy who does everything well. Kind of a jack of all trades, a guy who does hold the point of attack well, but it's also good at getting after the quarterback. They don't have like that guy who's like really stout at the defensive end position. And last year, the Jets quietly had two defensive ends who were undrafted free agents make the team. One was out of Michigan, a guy who was a national championship player, and that was Braden McGregor. And then they had a guy out of UConn, Eric Watts. Again, both of these guys made the initial 53-man roster. And they're both like on the bigger side for defensive ends. McGregor on the team's official roster is listed as 267, and Watts is listed as 277. And like, as much as like you're looking for depth, as much as you're looking for good players at a position, you also want guys who can fill specific roles. And I think that the Jets will be looking for like a defensive end who's like really stout in the run game. Now, of course, you want guys who can get after the quarterback as well. But there has to be like somebody on your team who can fill that role of being like the bigger guy, kind of like the anchor against the run on the edge. And I think both of these guys are going to get an opportunity. And the question comes down to, again, new coaching staff. How much can they coach these guys up? How much can they help them improve? And it's when you're talking about these types of roles, you don't necessarily need to be a star. And that's never going to be the objective when we're talking about a UDFA. You're looking for more guys who contribute, because this goes down to like economics. Undrafted free agents are playing essentially for the minimum, and most of the players on your team actually are playing for either the minimum or close to the minimum. And most of the guys who make the minimum aren't really producing much. So if you find a guy who's actually a useful role player who's making the minimum, that's an advantage to your team. And I think like for the Jets, you've got two shots at this. It's unlikely that McGregor and Watts will both be quality players for this role. In fact, the odds are against either of them. But we're talking about that's not our focus today. Our focus is on guys who can actually step up. But you got two shots at this. And if one of them pans out, one of them's a quality role player, then you've kind of gotten what you want. And I think this, you can also look at the defensive tackle position. You've got Quinnen Williams, again, excellent player. Jets are going to lean heavily on him for defensive tackle play. And then you don't really have that much there. They signed Derek Nandy from the Chiefs. They brought in Mathis. They've got Byron Cowart. There's not a lot of quality players there. So could like an undrafted rookie step up? Could it be like a Peyton Page out of Clemson, or a Fatorma Mulba out of West Virginia? I don't want to put too much on undrafted rookies, but the Jets had another undrafted rookie last year, Leonard Taylor, who showed he could handle a rotational job. And Taylor's got a pretty good shot at making the team in 2025, and he's got a pretty good shot at being a decent rotational guy. But could there be a second guy? Could there be a second defensive tackle who's able to handle a rotational spot for the Jets? Well, again, you got two options. And when we're talking about undrafted free agents, the odds are always against them. You should always bet the under on what an undrafted free agent is going to provide. If anybody's out there telling you like some undrafted free agent is going to make the team and going to make a big impact, you should always be a little skeptical on that. If someone's out there telling you an undrafted free agent has a shot to maybe carve out a role on special teams, or maybe find a role as a backup, that's more reasonable. And I think the Jets have two defensive tackles in here. Again, one is Peyton Page out of Clemson, the other is Fatorma Mulba out of West Virginia. Odds are against both making the team. Now, I know McGregor and Watts both made the team last year, but that's kind of an outlier. There aren't that many good defensive tackles on this team right now. So it gives an opportunity for a young guy to step up. And, like, we're not talking about someone who's going to pair with Quinnen Williams. We're not talking about someone who's going to dominate. But, every defensive tackle who's active on the game day is going to get some snaps. And you want those snaps to be decent snaps. You always want to have every snap that goes out to at least be a credible snap. So, we're not talking about guys we're expecting to play 70% of the snaps. We're talking about guys who maybe can step in for a play here or there and hold their own. And because of the Jets' relative weakness at defensive tackle, there's opportunities for maybe an undrafted rookie to steal a spot, maybe steal a role. Although Leonard Taylor last year, and Taylor did pretty solid. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this a thumbs up and 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.